Continuing E. A. Wallis Budge's The Dwellers on the Nile, The Life, History, Religion, and Literature of the Ancient Egyptians. We're still in Chapter 1, The Mother, the Family, the Home, and the School. The value of the arts of reading and writing and the knowledge of books was generally recognized by all classes in Egypt, and especially by the merchant and artisan classes, who believed that there was no position to which the learned scribe might not attain in the country. The art of the scribe had a pecuniary value. It opened the way to lucrative employment in the service of the government. It gave to the man who possessed it social standing and raised him above the greater number of his fellow countrymen who earned their living by performing manual labors. Man in general never considered it as a key that would unlock the treasures of learning laid up in the papyrus rolls in the temples, and would enable them to acquire the wisdom and knowledge that the sages of Egypt had stored up. Though among the nations round about them the Egyptians were famed for their learning, there is no evidence that, as a nation, they loved learning for its own sake, or sought after knowledge because they loved it. A proof of this fact was supplied to us by the teaching of one Tua'uf, as it is given in two papyri in the British Museums, numbers 10,182 and 10,222. Ta'uf set out one day to take his son Pepe to school, and as they were sailing up the Nile to the place where the school was, he talked to his son and tried to show him the merits of the scribe's profession. Some of his remarks may be summarized thus: I have considered hard work, and have concluded that books are the best things to study. I say then, give thy mind to books. In an ancient work it is written, the scribe may attain to every position at court. He need not go begging for employment there. The man who works for another never gains independent positions for himself. I have considered other trades and professions, and the same remark applies to them also. I would have thee love books as thou lovest thy mother, and I will set their beauties before thee. The profession of the scribes is the greatest of all professions. It has no equal upon earth. Even when the scribe is a beginner in his career, his opinion is consulted. Because obviously it's the knowledge of all other fields, just recorded. He is sent on missions of state and does not come back to place himself under the direction of another. Now take the worker in metals. Was a smith ever sent on a mission of state? The coppersmith has to work in front of his blazing furnace, and his fingers are like the crocodile's legs, and he stinks more than the insides of fish. The metal engraver works like a plowman. The mason is always overhauling blocks of stone, and in the evening he is tired out. His arms are weary, and the bones of his thighs and back feel as if they were coming asunder. The barber scours the town in search of customers. At the end of the day, he is worn out, and he tortures his hands and arms to fill his belly. The waterman is stung to death by the gnats and mosquitoes, and the stench of the canals chokes him. The ditcher in the fields works among the cattle and the pigs, and must cook his food in the open. His garments are still with mud. The builder of walls is obliged to hang to them like a creeper. His garments are filled with mortar and dust, and are in rags. The gardener must work every day, and all he does is exhausting. His shoulders are bowed by heavy loads he carries, and his neck and arms are distorted. He watches onions all morning and tends vines all the afternoon. The farm laborer never changes his garments, and his voice is like that of a corncrake. His hands, arms, and fingers are shriveled and cracked, and he smells like a corpse. The weaver is worse off than a woman. Okay, I wouldn't put these things in those words, but his thighs are drawn up to his body, and he cannot breathe. The day he fails to do his work, he is dragged from the hut like a lotus from the pool and cast aside. To be allowed to see the daylight, he must give the overseer his dinner. The armorer is ruined by his expenses. The caravan man goes in terror of lions and nomads whilst on his journey, and he returns to Egypt exhausted. The reed cutter's fingers stink like a fishmonger. His eyes are dull and lifeless, and he works naked all the day long at cutting reeds. The sandal maker spends his life in begging for work. His health is like that of the fish with a hook in its mouth. He gnaws stripes of leather. The washerman spends his whole day in beating clothes. He is a neighbor of the crocodile. His whole body is filthy, and his food is mixed up with his garments. If he delays in finishing his work, he is beaten. The lot of a fowler is hard, for though he wishes for a net, God does not give him one. The fisherman has the worst trade of all, for he has to work in the river among the crocodiles, and there is nothing to warn him of the vicinity of crocodile. His eyes are blinded with fear. There is no occupation than which a better cannot be found except the profession of the scribe, which is the best of all. Every toiler curses his trade or occupation except the scribes, for whom no one says, "Go and work in the fields for so-and-so." I am sailing up the river to the court, and I do it because of the love which I bear to thee. One day only spent in school is profitable for thee, and the work thou doest there will endure as long as the mountains. So we have brickmakers and brick-making processes going on there. Tualf continues, I will now say a few other words to thee for thy instruction. Decide carefully what thou wilt do. He who acts hastily knows not what the result will be. Use not words of doubtful meaning, for they will react against thee. Utter not words of pride and arrogance, even to thyself. When thou art dismissed from school at midday, go not about singing and shouting, and trespass not in the houses round about. Deliver accurately the message given to thee to carry. Add nothing thereto, omit nothing therefrom. And for the sake of the great chief, speak not lies against thy mother, and do nothing contrary to her wishes, even when thou art alone. If thou wilt control thy appetite, thou wilt be listened to. If having eaten 3 loaves and drunk 2 pitchers of beer, thy belly is not full, thou must fight against it. The scribe who hears is noted. He who hears becomes a man of power. Dawdle not on thy way, spare not thyself. Keep on friendly terms with thy young schoolfellows. The entity Rennit and Meskenet are with the scribe from his birth, until he becomes the chief of the town council, and they make him to prosper and flourish. His father and mother give praise to Ra. They have set him on the path of life. These are the things that I would set before thee and thy children's children. And we see Osiris depicted as a judge. enshrined by fire, and the living Rai snakes, Isith and Nephthys are behind him, and the 4 Horus sons. But we can think of all these so-called divinities without... Basically, monotheism captures the same thing, but without the without the limits of personification. But we can also look at things as, well, angels of this, that, and the other. So you can skip the worship and Tualf is thought to have composed his teaching near the end of the Old Kingdom, but as his work was made a textbook for schools under the New Kingdom 2,000 years after, it is pretty clear that his views on the profession of the scribe were endorsed by the fathers of sons in the latter period of its popularity. Tualf cared nothing for the training of the mind which the study of books should give the student. All he wanted for his son was freedom from manual labor, a good social position, and remuneration for his work on a generous scale. The schoolmaster probably received his pupils at his own house and provided the materials on which they learned to write hieroglyphs and the rolls of papyrus from which they copied passages selected by him for study. Now, the last book that I went through, we talked about the staunch ritualism. And mindless, it's a profession. Like a lot of artisans, it's you're just making something physical, but it's quite a shame to have a skill like reading and writing, particularly when it's not the usual, and to not use it for one's internal, and may I say, eternal benefit. Whether he wrote out these passages in black ink upon thin slices of limestone or upon whitened boards, as did the Copts, cannot be said. The pupils learned to draw hieroglyphs from lists prepared by him, and day by day they probably committed to memory, by frequent repetition, groups of words occupied by him from a vocabulary in which the words were classified as in a Coptic scala. The scala, or vocabulary, consists of a series of lists of objects, animate and inanimate, arranged in classes, and thus we have lists of names of countries and cities, lists of animals, birds, reptiles, trees, plants, minerals, parts of the body, etc. And it's probably that the early compilers of the Scala borrowed their system from their ancestors, the Egyptians. The schoolmaster's authority over his pupils was absolute. They came to his house in the early morning and worked until noon, when they were dismissed for the day. They sat literally at his feet, and it is quite clear from statements made in the papyri that their master frequently supplemented his oral instruction with corporeal punishment. Sleepy and lazy boys often felt his rod on their backs, for he had no fear of being summoned for assault on their persons before the local magistrate. Tibetan culture, at least during the time of the Dalai Lama, his childhood was like this. In one of the Anastasi papyrus, in the British Museum, we read, "A boy has a back, and he listens when he is beaten." Schoolmasters argue that if horses and lions and hawks can be made to learn and be trained to obey man, why not the boy and the youth? In addition to the education derived from books, Boys were taught to be active and industrious, and the letters which great scribes wrote to their pupils contain many rebukes for laziness and many exhortations to work with all their might. The lazy were always threatened with a beating, and one sage pertinently remarks, "The ears of a boy are set on his back, and if you beat him, he will listen." At some time during the school hours, the boys ate their 3 bread cakes and drank their 2 jugs of beer. The boy who was not satisfied with these was held to be a gluttonous creature. Unfortunately, the inscriptions gave no details of the system of instruction followed by a schoolmaster, and it is not known how he was paid or by whom the school was supported. The apparatus used by him in teaching was of a very simple character, and scarcely any school furniture was necessary. There may have been secondary schools attached to the temple, wherein clever youths were trained for special work, but this is uncertain. The scribe's equipment consisted of writing reeds and a palette, a water pot, and a wrist rest, all of which are represented in the hieroglyph for scribe. And see that little thing right there? The palette was a long, narrow strip of wood or piece of stone in which there were 2 shallow, round hollows, one to hold black ink and the other red, and a groove in which the writing reeds were placed. These varied in length from 4 inches to 12 inches, and were about a 1/16 of an inch thick. The water pot was attached to the palette by a short cord, and both were fastened to the wrist rest. The principal material used for writing upon was papyrus, but leather was also used, and drafts of important documents were written upon slices of fine white limestone and upon pieces of broken pots. Ostraca. Papyrus was made by gumming together layers of strips cut from the stalk of the papyrus plant, which grew in abundance in the swamps and marshes of Egypt. The heads of the large variety of the plant, which is found in the Sudan, were cooked and eaten by the natives. The strips were peeled off from the stalk and laid in a row, and their edges were fastened together by gum. Another layer of strips was laid horizontally across the first layer and fastened to it by gum. When pressed and trimmed, the sheets of papyrus thus made were ready for use. The sheet could be made almost any length by attaching new strips from a plant at one end. The width of the largest sheet of papyrus known is about 20 inches, and the length of the longest roll about 133 feet. I'm reminded of the story of Joseph Smith with the papyrus stretched across his home. The papyrus roll was called Chama'a. Okay, Chama'a. Okay, and obviously it has that little knot thing at the end. The color of papyrus varied in different periods, from dark to light brown, but in the Potomac and later periods, many papyri are light yellow or cream color, and some are nearly white. Papyrus, as a writing material, plays a very important part in the history of Egyptian scripts. The pre-dynastic Egyptians used pictographs in their writings, just as did the Amazonites and Sumerians. But whilst these people, who had nothing but clay to use the writing material, finding they could not easily draw figures of animals, circles, etc. on it, developed the cuneiform system of writing. Well, hieroglyphic is different from pictographic. Pictographic isn't, it's not sounded out. Developed in which the original forms of the pictographs disappeared. The Egyptians were able to draw their pictographs in ink easily on papyrus, and so preserve the use of hieroglyphs in writing until the Roman period. Papyri were preserved in the form of rolls, and the hieroglyph for book shows that the papyrus roll was kept in shape by a papyrus cord, and later a strip of linen, which was tied in a knot and sometimes fastened by a clay seal. Important rolls were usually preserved in wooden boxes. The Papyrus of Nu and the Harris Papyrus number 1, both in the British Museum, were found in boxes, and both the papyri and their boxes were sealed with clay slabs, with clay seals bearing the inscriptions made by inscribed scarabs. Business documents, letters, etc. were stored in earthenware parts, especially in the Greco-Roman and Coptic periods. The black ink used was, in earlier times, made of charcoal, water, and a little gum, but in latter days, mineral preparation, which made the ink bite into the papyrus, was added. It was found that the characters written in the ink with gum on it often flaked off. The red ink and the various colored paints that were used in the decoration of the papyri were made of mineral substances. Red ink was used chiefly in writing the titles and catchwords in literary compositions, and in making the red dots that mark the ends of the members of sentences. In the Book of the Dead, the titles of the chapters and many rubrics and names of devils are written in red ink. Full descriptions of all the implements used by the Egyptian scribe will be found in the Guide to the First, Second, and Third Egyptian Rooms in the British Museum, London, 1924. And if this is still the case, if it's not still the case, that'd be a good point to comment.